All right, Shabbosai, good morning. We have a lot to do today, an incredible daf ahead of us today. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors, Daf Yomi sponsors, our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Nissan, to thank Jerry and Happy Abelbaum for dedicating all the shiurim in memory of Basya Bas Chaim and David Ben Avram, Doctors Paul and Linda Weinberg for dedicating the shiurim this month in memory of Mordechai Yehoshua, Ben Peretz Moshe, Miriam, Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating the shiurim, the zchus of refuah, sheileimah for Donna Baker-Matson, Teri Czinn for dedicating the shiurim this month in honor of their grandson Bunim Tzvi Hersch, Naftali Tilson for dedicating the shiurim this month with hakaras hatov to his chaver Benjamin Wohl and to the entire shir, Avraham Shaindy Kelman for dedicating the shiurim this month, the commemoration of the yahrzeit of Sara Braina bas Yehoshua Heschel, and our Daf Yomi sponsor for today, Robert Emas, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of his father, Yaakov Ben Ruven. And we hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the neshamas will have an aliyah and the families a nechama. With that, let us begin. Today's daf is daf nun 50. We are picking up on. I think there's something wrong with it today. I'm sorry. It's the highest volume. So you can look at it if you want. I turned a couple of things. All right. Anyway, so I'll say so. The lights aren't working, the microphone's not working. We do have a building fund, by the way, Mir Hashem. We are building a new building. So, all right, so Mir Hashem. So I'll say so today's daf is Nun 50. We are picking up on Nentes Amud Beis 49b, and we left off in the incredible story of Menashe and Yeshayahu. How ultimately, again, remember, Menashe kills his own grandfather, right? Menashe kills Yeshayahu, ultimately because he felt that his grandfather had purposely misinterpreted psukim, that his prophecies, his prophetic words, were going ahead and contradicting those of Moshe Rabbeinu. So we saw again the dramatic circumstances, first of all, surrounding Yeshaya's absorption into a tree, his ultimate death. Now the Gemara is going to go back and try to reconcile some of the prophecies of Yeshayahu with the words of Moshe Rabbeinu. So the Gemara says, Mikol Makom Kashu Kraya Adadi. So we'll say picking up, it's 2, 4, 6, 8 lines off from the bottom. So the Gemara says, but nevertheless, okay, how do we reconcile the prophetic messages of Yeshayahu with Moshe Rabbeinu? Because the psukim do seem to contradict each other, to which the Gemara says, remember again, Ve'eres Hashem. So remember, let's go back for just a moment. The first contradiction was Moshe Rabbeinu said, Kilo Yurani Ha'adam V'chai. Moshe Rabbeinu said, a person can't see me and live. And remember again, Yeshayahu said, Ve'era es Hashem Yoshev al Kisei Raminisa. And Yeshayahu said, I'm able to see Hashem sitting on the great throne. So how do we reconcile that? So the Gemara says, Kidisanya, Kol Hanaviyim nistaklu ba'aspaklaria she'ena me'ira. We'll say, listen to this. So remember, what's the contradiction? So Yeshayahu seemed to say, I saw HaKadosh Baruch Hu sitting on his throne. So Yeshayahu seems to indicate that you could see Hashem, versus Moshe Rabbeinu who said, you can't see Hashem. So how do I reconcile this? So here we go. This is incredible. Kidisanya, Kol Hanaviyim nistaklu ba'aspaklaria she'ena me'ira. All of the Nevi'im saw HaKadosh Baruch Hu through an aspeclaria. We'll call aspeclaria meaning just a scope or a vision that was unclear. Moshe Rabbeinu nistakel ba'aspeclaria hami'ira. Moshe Rabbeinu saw with complete clarity of vision. So how does that answer the question? I both say this is absolutely profound. Look at Rashi. Last Rashi on the daf. Nistaklu ba'aspeclaria she'ina me'ira ukisvurim liros velo ro'u. So both said Moshe nistaka ba'aspeclaria me'ira v'yada sh'lo b'fanav. Both said let me explain the words and explain the concept. Moshe Rabbeinu, who had the greatest amount of clarity and prophetic vision, realized that what he saw was not complete. Ultimately, again, poor Maishi, the guy's just back, he's taking care of lights, sound. Alright, so somebody's going to tell him there's a spill on aisle 9 next. Maishi, thank you. So what happens? So this is absolutely incredible. So what's incredible to see is as follows. Moshe Rabbeinu, who had, quote-unquote, complete clarity of vision, realized that what he saw was incomplete. Everyone else who did not have complete clarity of vision thought that what they saw was complete, when in fact it was incomplete. Meaning what? That halacha l'maaseh will say sometimes you don't know what you don't know. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu, who had the greatest clarity of vision that a human being could have, recognized that even with all of that clarity, he was not seeing the complete nature of the Ribono Shel Olam. And that's why Moshe Rabbeinu says, Ki lo yirani ha'adam v'chai. Moshe Rabbeinu said, I have seen more than any other mortal could possibly see. And yet I know that what I have seen is not complete. Other people who did not have the clarity of vision thought that what they saw was everything to see. So Yehoshua Heschel thinks that he's seen God. See, he says, I saw HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Moshe Rabbeinu, who saw more than any other mortal, realized that he was only seeing but a glimpse, which I will say is such a profound idea. Sometimes, when you know very little, you think you know a lot. But when you know a lot, you realize how very little you truly know. Such a profound yesod. Moshe Rabbeinu, who sees HaKadosh Baruch Hu, realizes, this is but a tip of the iceberg. Yeshayahu, who saw very little, thought that he saw a lot. Incredible. The Gemara goes weiter. What about the second issue? Dirshu Hashem b'himatzo. Shabbos said the second issue was that Moshe Rabbeinu said, Mika Hashem Elokeinu b'chol kar'inu elav. Moshe Rabbeinu said, who is like Hashem, who is always available to us. Which sounds like you could connect with HaKadosh Baruch Hu whenever you want. Versus Yeshayahu who said, Dirshu Hashem b'himatzo. Seek out Hashem when He is available. Which sounds like at times Hashem is available, and at times, or actually not available, accessible, and at times He's not. So how do you reconcile those two? No problem. The Gemara says, Dirshu Hashem b'himatzo, habiyachid, habitzibor. I will say, incredible. When you reach out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu as a yachid, there are times where God is more accessible, and times that God is less accessible. But when you reach out to Hashem as part of a tzibor, as part of a minyan, as part of a collective, as part of a congregation, then the Ribono Shel Olam is always accessible. Says the Gemara, V'yochid Emas, when is HaKadosh Baruch Hu accessible even to the individual? Rav Nachman Rav Baravua, Elu Asar Yomim Bein Shebein Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippurim. Wow. They will say, when is HaKadosh Baruch Hu accessible even to the Yachid? Aseres Meitzvah. So I will say, such an incredible idea. Therefore, again, when Moshe Rabbeinu says, Mi Kashem Elokeinu b'chol kar'inu elav, who is like Hashem, who is always accessible to us, that's in the context of a tzibor. When you embed yourself as part of a collective, when you embed yourself as part of a congregation, when you are part of something bigger than yourself, then the zchus of the rabbim allows you to access the Ribono Shel Olam whenever and wherever you want. But when you go at it yourself, then ultimately, again, there's more limited connection. But there is a time when even the Yachid could access HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right, in an unfiltered way, and that's Aseres Mitzvah, the days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Incredible. So the Gemara goes right there. The Gemara says, Mispar Yamecha Amalei. This is incredible. So I'll say the last issue was as follows. Moshe Rabbeinu said, "Es mispar yamecha amalei," which sounds like, ultimately again, every person has a fixed lifetime, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not subtract or add to the number of years of a person's lifetime. Versus Yeshayahu, who said, "V'osafti al yamecha chamesh esrei shana." So Yeshayahu said, I will add on to your life 15 years, which sounds like Kadosh Baruch Hu does add on to the lifetime of a person. So which one is it? Is a lifetime fixed, or ultimately again can it be added or subtracted from? Tush the Gemara says Tanaihi. This is fascinating. It's Machlokes Tanaim. The Sanya es mispar yamecha amalei. The pasuk says, Moshe Rabbeinu says, I will go ahead and literally fill out the days of, or complete the days of your life. Top of Nun, Elu Shnei Doros. I will say this refers ultimately again to the number of years that Rashi says over here, Shanim Sheposkin La'adam B'Shas Leidaso. When a person is born, there's a certain lifetime that is decreed for that individual. Zocha Mashlimelo. If a person is Zocha, right, if a person lives a correct kind of life, then halacha l'maisa, he gets those years. lo zacha, right? If you don't have the requisite zchuyos, pochesin lo, ultimately those years are diminished. Div Rabbi Akiva. These are the words of Rabbi Akiva. So we'll say in Rabbi Akiva's model, when you come into this world, you're given a certain number of years, right? The number of years does not go up. But what can happen? They could be diminished, right? So if I'm zocha, I get my predestined number of years. If I'm not zocha, right? If I haven't earned them, then ultimately they can be diminished. The Chacham say no, zocha mosifin, lo zocha pochsin. The Chacham seem to say that halacha l'maisa, if you're zocha, you get more years. If you're not zocha, you get less years. So fundamental machlokes, I will say, about ultimately, again, how we go ahead and establish or how we look at the lifespan of a person. Amr Rabbi Akiva, they said to Rabbi Akiva, Hareyu Omer v'hosafti al yamecha chamesh esrei shana. But Rabbi Akiva, what do you do with the pasuk that says, I will add on to your life 15 years, which is the Yevamos saying that lifespan can be elongated. Amr lahem mishalo hosifulo. So Rabbi Akiva will say that pasuk, I will say the pasuk is in Malachim Beis. So we'll say, remember again, this is by Melech Chizkiyahu, right? So by Melech Yeshayahu says to Chizkiyahu, I will add on to your lifespan 15 years. They say, Rabbi Akiva, what do you do with the fact that Yeshayahu said to Chizkiyahu, I'm going to give you 15 more years of life? What about that? To which the Gemara Rabbi Akiva will say, Amr lahem mishalo hosifulo. This is fascinating. What the Navi was really saying to Chizkiyahu was, you were going to lose 15 years of your predestined lifespan because you were not zocha. I'm going to give you back those predetermined years. In other words, he wasn't getting extra years. He was getting the years with which he was born that he was going to lose, because ultimately, again, the story we spoke about yesterday, I'm going to give you back those years that were already yours. Look at Rashi. Mishalo sifalo, ela shemitchila hayrotzim livchos mishanav. They're going to take away those 15 years from Chizkiyahu, and now the Navi says, I'm going to give them back to you. Teida, shari Navi omed va'omed u'misnabev, and I can tell you that here's the proof. What's the proof? The proof is that the Navi is standing and prophesying, and he says, Hinei ben nolad lebeis David Yehoshua shmo. The Navi says that there's going to be a king from the Davidic line by the name of Yehoshua, va'dayin lo nolad Menashe. And I will say the prophecy about Yehoshua was said even before Menashe's father was born. To which the Gemara says, Rabbanan. So we'll say, see from here, look at Rashi, you see from here, Shahari Navi Nisnavi B'mei Yeravam Shanim Harbe Kodem Hine Ben Nolad LeBeis David Yoshio Shmo Ubishas Choyo Shel Chizkiyahu Dayin Lo Nolad Menashe Shimenu Yatsi Yoshio Havi Omer Bishas Choyo Gazro Livchos Mishanav Ukishazach Shlimalo. The fact that when Chizkiyahu was sick, they already prophesied. Right before Chizkiyahu was sick, they already prophesied that he was going to have a grandson, Yoshio. Menashe wasn't even born. So you see from here that it was predestined. Ultimately, again, the Chizkiyahu was going to live. He's going to have a son, Menashe, grandson, Yoshio. And when the Navi says you're going to get another 15 years, it wasn't another 15 years, but rather what? The Gemara says, Miksiv Michizkiyahu. LeBeis David doesn't say from Chizkiyahu to Beis David. No. The truth is, the Gemara says it could have been from Chizkiyahu, it could have been from someone else. The idea being that there was going to be a king by the name of Yoshio, who he was going to come from. That could have been the variable. We'll say, but for our purposes, again, it is not a stira between Yeshayahu and Moshe Rabbeinu, but rather, again, it represents two different schools of thought with how HaKadosh Baruch Hu determines the lifespan of man. Quite incredible. One opinion saying man is born with a fixed number of years and they're his to lose. They're his to lose. You're not getting any more than what HaKadosh Baruch Hu ordained for you when you came into this world. That number is fixed. The only variable is negative behavior could diminish those number of years. But there's a ceiling. All of us are born with a lifespan ceiling. Versus Rabbi Akiva, who says halacha l'maisa. No. I'm sorry, that is Rabbi Akiva. Chachamim say absolutely not. Absolutely not. Lifespan is a variable. If you do the right thing, you get more years. You do the wrong thing, you get less years. So we'll just follow who's right. It's a fundamental machlokes and how HaKadosh Baruch Hu determines lifespans in this world. I'll just point out something very interesting. If you take a look at Tosas says over at the top, Tosas on Nun Amadaf, Mosifan Lo, V'hadar Moed Katan, Bane Chaye Umizone, Lav B'schus Talya Milsa, Ela B'mazla Talya Milsa. Shabbos say, this is incredible. Tosas says, Rabbanan, Chachamim want to advance a model that if you merit it, you could have a longer life. And ultimately, again, if you don't merit it, you have a shorter life. Which sounds like the entire lifespan of a person is determined or is based on their actions, their dynamic spiritual activity. The Tosas says, here's the problem. That Gemara Maseches Moed Katan says, there are certain things that are dependent on mazel. Right? However you write mazel, right? Nothing to do with your individual merit. So what are the things that are dependent on mazel? Children, chayein, right? Lifespan, mizone, parnasa. So how could the Chachamim say over here that your lifespan is dependent on your zechuyos? They both say, look what Tosas says. There's something so profound. Pshita the zchus gadol moil. Wow. So Tosas says also something absolutely amazing. Tosas says, even if you subscribe to the idea that children parnasa lifespan is dependent on mazel, everyone agrees that a zchus gadol. We'll say, what's a zchus gadol? Dynamic, dramatic life activity changes the equation. Could tilt the scales. We'll say, isn't this absolutely profound? Even if you subscribe to a model that says that there are certain things in life that may be determined by mazel, there is no such thing as an inability to control your fate. There's no such thing as an inability to control the trajectory of your life. Because a zchus gadol, a dynamic act, a dramatic act, always has the ability to change the direction your life is going. Such an incredible yesod. Even if you subscribe to the concept that there are certain things governed by mazel, zchus gadol, take dynamic, dramatic, decisive action and change the course of your life. Incredible. Ishto shemesa, yivimto shemesa. Remember again, the end of the Mishnah spoke about the idea that achos isha, that the prohibition to marry one's wife's sister applies as long as what? One's wife is alive, even if what? Even if you're no longer married. So the Mishnah illustrated this with a whole bunch of cases, right? If you divorce her, you still can't marry your sister. But if she dies, you can marry her sister. If you divorce her and she marries someone else and then dies, you can marry her sister. If she divorced, right? A whole bunch of cases, but the bottom line was always the same, which is the prohibition of achos isha applies even if you're divorced your wife, as long as she's still alive. It's only once she dies the prohibition goes away. To which the Gemara says, Rabbi Yosef, Kan Shana Rebbe, Mishnah Shein Tzricha. Here Rebbe taught an unnecessary Mishnah. Look at Rashi. Mishnah Shein Tzricha. Dizil Kari Bei Rav, Hu Allah Bechaya, Shalo Ne'esra Achos Ela Bechaya. The both say this is before Shapasik, right? That ultimately, again, the pasuk says, Aleha Bechayeha. That ultimately wife's sister is prohibited as long as the wife is alive, even if husband and wife are no longer married. It's an explicit pasuk in the Torah, and Rebbe yet felt the need to mention it in the Mishnah, which is fine, but the fact that he went ahead and felt the need to express it in all of the various cases, so ultimately Rabbi Yosef says, unnecessary Mishnah. Unnecessary Mishnah. Good. They'll say, Mazel Tov, Hadron Aloch, HaCholetz. Mazel Tov, another parak of Yevamos under our belt. What a feeling. What a feeling. Good. We'll say, let's go weiter. Now we come to a really fascinating sugya. Rabbi Gamliel Omer, Ein get achar get, v'lo ma'amar achar ma'amar, v'lo be'ila achar be'ila, v'lo chalitza achar chalitza. Okay. So we'll say, here we go. So what's the case over here? So let's go through these. Rabbi Gamliel says, there is no case of a get, achar get. Now, bless you, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. Ein get, achar get. So Rashi says over here, Ein get, achar get. Shtei Yevamos la'adam echad. We'll say a very straightforward case. Right? Let's say again, Ruven has two women waiting for him. He had two brothers who died. Right? Shimon and Levi both passed away, leaving behind widows, Rachel and Leah. Right? They will say, unlike Rachel and Leah are unrelated to each other. Right? They're two women. Actually, I take that back. Shimon passed away. Shimon had two wives, Rachel and Leah. Okay, now Ruven, right? Rachel and Leah are the sisters-in-law, right? Both the wives of the deceased Shimon, now waiting for Ruven for Yibo. Okay, that's the case. So Shtei Yevamos la'adam echad me'ach echad. So two women, two wives of Shimon. Shimon passes away. The two women fall for Yibum to Ruven. Now what did Ruven do? Rashi says, V'nasan get lezu v'get lezu. Ruven gave a get to Rachel and a get to Leah. Like I said, don't ask why. He just did it. Right? So we'll say, what's the halacha? Eino aser b'krovos shniya. Shdi'i kama ahani hapaka zeka de tarbayu. So we'll say, listen to this. Now here's the shayla. Now we're going to see, we already saw, once you give a get to your Yevam Rabbosai, what's the halacha? What do you have to do now? Chalitza. Right? Because essentially, although a get doesn't end zika. Right? It doesn't really end zika. But what it essentially does is it kind of, at least midrabanan, says you can no longer do yibum. So the Hero will say, here's the shaila. So let's take a step back for just a moment. Here's what we know. When you do chalitza with a woman, so a chalutza is essentially treated like a grusha. And when a woman is a grusha, ultimately, again, you're prohibited in the grusha's relatives. So the shaila that we're going to deal with over here is as follows. When Ruven gives a get to Rachel and then a get to Leah, so what's his limitation in terms of Leah's relatives, the second wife? I understand that maybe by Rachel, the first wife he gave a get to, ultimately, again, he's going to do chalitza, and halacha l'maisa, again, he's going to be prohibited in her relatives afterwards. What's the implication of giving a get to Leah, the second wife? So Rabbi Gamliel says, ein get achar get. Once you give a get to Rachel, right, so the get you give to Leah is meaningless and inconsequential, which means that Leah remains an unrelated party. So obviously, it's still going to have to be chalitza that's done, but assuming that Ruven ends up doing chalitza with Rachel, Ruven is not prohibited at all to any of Leah's relatives. Go back to Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, "Shtei Yevamos la'adam echad me'ach echad v'nasan get lezu v'get lezu." So Ruven went ahead and gave a get to Rachel and gave a get to Leah. Eino asa b'krovo shniya. He is not prohibited in the relatives of Leah. Di'i kama hani, because we'll say, let's play this out, Marashach. If the first get that he gave to Rachel, if that get worked, hapaka zeka de tarvaihu, the zika of both of the women was gone. Right? And if the first get didn't do anything, then ultimately, again, basranami lo mahani, the second get doesn't do anything either. It's therefore, again, Rabbi Gamliel essentially says is like this. We're not totally sure exactly what giving a get to a Yevama does. We're going to see it's a machlokas. But here's what I know. If giving the first get to Rachel dissolves the zeka, then ultimately the second get to Leah is what? Is meaningless because the zeka has already been dissolved. And if the first get is not meaningful at all, right? If the first get is meaningless, then what? The second get is meaningless as well. So Mimanav Shach, Rabbi Gamliel says the second get has no implications. Leah is like an unrelated party, assuming that he ends up doing chalitza with Rachel, and therefore he'd be permitted to go ahead and marry the relatives of Leah sometime later on. That's what it means in get achar get. Similarly, v'lo ma'amar achamar. Look at next Rashi. V'lo ma'amar achamar. Rashi says, ben yavam echel shtei yavamis, ben shnei yavam liyav ma'achas ha'acharon in klum lifsas harishona alav ve'ina tzrichem and a get v'lo asr kroshni. Both say same idea. If he does ma'amar with Rachel and then ma'amar with Leah, the ma'amar with Leah is inconsequential. Again, we'll see all this in the Gemara. V'lo bi'ila achar bi'ila. Now we'll say this is an interesting one. What if he has relations with Rachel and then relations with Leah? So the Gemara says the relations with Leah are meaningless. Now we'll say, what does that mean, meaningless? Look at Rashi. V'lo bi'ila achar bi'ila. Ba'al zeh v'chazra ba'hu o achar ba'al sarasa bias znus ba'amahu ve'in asa b'kravoseh. So we'll say what that means is the second act of bia is not an act of yibum, right? And halacha l'maisa, it is prohibited, right? And it is an isra of znus. When it says it's meaningless, it means it does not create halachic realities. So we'll say this is the shita of Rabbi Gamliel, that essentially once you perform a process with one of the women, the process done with the other woman is halachically meaningless. And therefore, again, that woman remains an unrelated party. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, once the union is dissolved, right? Once the union is dissolved, halacha l'maisa, you remain permitted to the relatives of wife number 2. Again, we'll define this more in the Gemara. Chum the Chum, on the other hand, say, yesh get achar get, yesh ma'amar achamar. So we'll say the Chum disagree. The Chacham say there is get achar get. Look at Rashi. First white line in Rashi. Second one. First and second one. Yesh get achar get. The kamalo dakal gamre. Hilchach akati ika pal gezeka. Dahaboy chalitza. Hilchach ahani basra. Vahavi grushasa va'asa v'kravosel. Shabbos listens. Chacham say not true. Not true. Shabbos like when you give a get. Right. Let's play this out. Right, so Shimon dies. Shimon left behind two wives, Rachel and Leah. The two women now fall to Ruvain for Yibum. So Ruvain gives Rachel a get. So we'll say, so what happens when Ruvain gives Rachel a get? Does that get dissolve the Zika? Does it dissolve the Zika? Even if you say that a get does something, it's certainly what? Doesn't do everything. So therefore, again, the Chachamim will say, there's still a Zika. And therefore, again, when Ruvain now gives a second get to Leah, that is a meaningful act as well, because there's still a zika. There's still a zika there, right? It still exists. And therefore, Allah Lamaisa, the Chum will say, both women essentially take on the status of a grusha, which means that even if he goes ahead and subsequently does chalitza with Rachel, he still remains prohibited to the relatives of Leah by dint of the get that he gave her. The second get is meaningful. Similarly, yesh ma'amar achamar. Similarly, again, ultimately, ma'amar achamar is also going to go ahead and be meaningful. Also, we'll see how that plays out. Avalo bi'ila achar bi'ila, avalo lo achar bi'ila, velo achar chalitza klum. What the Chachamim will say is that halacha l'maisa, once there's bia, we'll say bia is yibum. Once there's Yibum, then what? Anything that occurs after Yibum is meaningless. In other words, anything that occurs with the second wife after Yibum is meaningless. Similarly, once there's Chalitza, anything that occurs after Chalitza is meaningless. So what Chum are adding on over here is that Halacha L'maisa, once you do Yibum or Chalitza, we're done. We're done. So anything you do with the second wife afterwards is meaningless. But Halacha L'maisa, anything before Yibum or Chalitza is potentially meaningful. So yesh get achar get, yesh ma'amar achar ma'amar. So we'll say the fundamental machlokes over here we're going to really see is, according to Rabbi Gamliel is unsure about what the get does or doesn't do. He's unsure about what ma'amar does or doesn't do. So if get works, says Rabbi Gamliel, then after he gave the get to the first wife, whatever you do to the second wife is meaningless. If get doesn't work, if it's meaningless for wife one, meaningless for wife number two. Same thing with ma'amar. The Chacham hold no. Get is somewhat effective, but doesn't dissolve the zeka. And therefore, again, giving a get to both women has an implication on both women. Ma'amar, implication for both women. But once you do yibum, or once you do chalitza, that's it, the process is over. So Ketzad. So the Gemara says, and I will say, Ketzad ultimately, again, is telling us, what's the case? How do you illustrate this case? Here we go. Asam ma'amar biyavimto, v'nasan la get. So we'll say, here we go. So let's say he went ahead. And I both say, this is illustrating this first in a case of one yavam, one yavama. Case of asam ma'amar b'ivimto, v'nasan laget. So I'll say, let's say again, simple case, right? Shimon dies, leaves behind one wife, Rachel. Ruvain now has to do yibum chalitza. What does Ruvain do? Ruvain does ma'amar with Rachel, right? Ma'amar with Rachel, v'nasan laget, and then he gives her a get. Okay, are we done yet? No. Tzricha himena chalitza. Still need chalitza. Right, so also we know this. Again, Gemara's Mishnah now is just illustrating all the different variations of cases. It's just a simple case. One yavam, one yavama. So Ruvain does ma'amar with Rachel, apparently with the intention to marry her, do yibum. Right? Then he gives her a get. The get doesn't fully dissolve the union, you still need chalitza. Okay. Asam ma'amar v'chalitza. I will say, what happens if Ruvain does ma'amar with Rachel? But what? Now he does chalitza. Is that enough? No, tzricha himena get. You still need a get. Because you must remember again, once you do ma'amar, you need something to dissolve the ma'amar, midrabanan, besides chalitza. Okay? Also ma'amar ubal. What happens if halacha l'maisa he did ma'amar, and then he had relations with her? Harezu kimitzvasa. Then I both say, ultimately, again, that's, what do we call that? That's called yibum. And we're done. Good. I will say, here we go. Nasan get, va'asa ma'amar. What happens if he first gave her a get? Again, I will say, these are just all variations of different cases, right? So the Yavam, right, Ruvain gave Rachel a get, and then he did ma'amar. Okay, so what's the halacha? Tzricha get v'chalitza. So we'll say in that case she's going to need to get. In other words, we'll say what you begin to see is anytime you do ma'amar and then you decide that you don't want to do yibum with this woman, what do you have to do? Right? You need chalitza, because you always need chalitza to close it out. But once there's a ma'amar, you're going to require a get as well. Nasan get ubal. What happens if he gave her a get? Ultimately, again, and then he had relations with her. So listen to this. Tzricha get the chalitza. So we'll say, this is fascinating. You need to get in a chalitza. Why did I both say? Because here's what the Mishnah is teaching. We'll see this in the Gemara. Once you give a get to your Yevama, what are you effectively doing? You are essentially closing out the possibility of Yibum. That's what the get says. So now, even when you subsequently have relations with, man has relations with, or Reuven has relations with Rachel, that's a bias nus. That's an act of immorality. That's a prohibited act. And therefore, again, halacha l'maisi has to give her a get and chalitza. Nasan get the chalatz. If he gave her a get and then did chalitza, ein achar chalitza klum. Ultimately, we'll say, so again, once you do chalitza, as you saw in the Mishnah, halacha l'maisa, we are done. I will say, here we go. Chalatz va'asam ma'amar, nasan get ubal. So we'll say, listen to this case. What happens if halacha l'maisa, he did chalitza, right? He did chalitza. And then after chalitza, did one of the following. Asa ma'amar, nasan get, ubal. So right, so chalitza step one. And then after chalitza, he did either ma'amar, get, or relations. Or baal, or ultimately had relations. Va'asa ma'amar, nasan get, the chalatz. Ein achar chalitza klum. So we'll say, the one thing we do know is, right, that everyone is agreeing with over here is that what? Once you do chalitza, what happens? We're done. See, I will say, here's what's interesting. If you notice, by the way, that's not necessarily the case with bia, because we did see a case where there's bia, but yet bia doesn't end the process, right? Remember, where do we see that? If he gives her a get first, and then does bia, you might have thought that, he did bia, so what is bia? Bia is yibum. No, so you see that halacha l'maisa, if he gave her a get, we're going to see that midrabanan, get precludes yibum. So you could have a get, then bia, which looks like yibum, right? And yet, nevertheless, halacha l'maisa, we're still going to require a chalitza after that, which is fascinating. Yet by chalitza, once the chalitza is done, the process is over. No days, I will say. Achos yevama, achos liyavam echad, v'achas shtei yevamos liyavam echad. I will say, all of these principles apply whether we're dealing with one yavam to one yevama, or one yavam to two yevamos. Right, so I will say, now watch this. Now we're going to illustrate the case with one yavam, two yevamos, which I will say, remember again, that's our case that we were seeing before. Halacha l'maisa, right? Shimon passes away. Shimon has two wives, Rachel and Leah. Up until now, we were dealing with Shimon died, he had one wife, Rachel, and these are all, up until now, there's all the variations of the case between Ruven the yavam and Rachel the yavama. Now, Shimon passed away, left behind two wives, Rachel and Leah. Here we go. Ketzad. Asa ma'amar bezu u'ma'amar bezu. If Ruvain did ma'amar with Rachel and ma'amar with Leah, tzrichos shnei gittin v'chalitza. Ultimately, what are you going to need, Rabbi say? What are you going to need? Two gittin and chalitza, right? So remember again, two gittin for who? One for Rachel, one for Leah. How many acts of chalitza? Just one. Who do you do chalitza with? Whoever you want, right? So we'll say, remember again, now that clearly this seems to be reflecting the view of the Chachamim of yesh get achar get. Right? We'll see in the Gemara, yesh get achar get. Good. Ma'amar lezu uveget lezu. We'll say, what happens if he does ma'amar with Rachel, and let's say a get with Leah? So we'll say, what's the halacha? Tzricha get v'chalitza. So you need a get for who? Rachel, the ma'amar wife, and chalitza. Right, because remember again, once a get has been given, you no longer have an option for what? Yibum. Right, Yibum is off the table. So once get was given, Yibum is off the table. There has to be a chalitza. So I will say, remember again, whenever we're going to talk about, I just want just to clarify, in a case where you do ma'amar with two women, you're going to need a get for both of those women. But chalitza never has to be done with more than what? One wife. Very important distinction. Ma'amar bazu balzu. What happens if he does ma'amar with Rachel and bia with Leah? So what's the halacha? Tzrichos beis gittin. You're going to require 2 gittin v'chalitza, and ultimately again a chalitza. Okay, take a look at Rashi. Tzrichos shnei gittin. Rashi says kirabanan. This is what we just mentioned before. So good, fine. We'll go through this. Tzrichos beis gittin v'chalitza. Ma'amar bezu v'chalatz lezu. So we'll say, what happens if he did ma'amar with Rachel and chalitza with Leah? So what happens over here? Harishona tzricha get. So we'll say, so remember again, in this case, so chalitza has already been done. Once chalitza has been done, then what? We're done. But remember, you do have to address the fact that there is a ma'amar wife over here, so she's going to require a get. Get lezu, the get lezu. We'll say, what happens if you went out and you gave a get to Rachel and to Leah? So what's the halacha? Tzrichos heimenu chalitza. They are going to require chalitza. Now look at Rashi. Tzrichos heimenu chalitza. We'll say the lashon is a little misleading because it sounds like both women are going to require chalitza. So Rashi points out over here, achos v'aser bekrovos shniya d'rabanan hu the achar get. So Rabbi says, so obviously whenever, as I mentioned before, whenever we require chalitza only is required by one wife. Get lezu, uba'al lezu. What happens if he gave Rachel a get, right, and had bia with Leah? So what's the halacha? Tzricha get v'chalitza. Ultimately, again, you're going to require a get. And chalitza. Okay? So the Gemara says, get lezu. I just want to point out, these are all just variations in the same cases, but what you begin to see is as follows. Halacha l'maisa, once you give a get, so let's go through with what we know, right? Once you give a get, then what's going to happen? Yibum is impossible, right? That's what we know, right? Yibum cannot be done. How you reconcile, right? How you deal with it, but Yibum is not going to be possible, right? Once you have chalitza, case is closed. But even once you do chalitza, if the only exception is that if a ma'amar was done with one of the women, then you're going to have to what? Undo the ma'amar. You're going to have to unwind some of these things. So get lezu, ma'amar lezu. What happens if you give a get to Rachel, ma'amar to Leah? Tzricha get the chalitza. You're going to require a get for the ma'amar wife and chalitza. Okay. Get lezu, v'chalatz lezu. What happens if you gave a get to Rachel and chalitza to Leah? Then Rabbi say in that case what? But this is an easy case, right? Get to Rachel, chalitza to Leah. Rabbi say, what do you need? Nothing. Right? Because remember again, you gave a get to Rachel, there's no follow-up on that, and you did chalitza with Leah. We're done. Ein achar chalitza klum. Ultimately, again, once chalitza is done, we're done. We're done here. Chalatz v'chalatz. So we'll say, what happens if you did chalitza with Rachel, chalitza with Leah? Oh, chalatz v'asa ma'amar. Or you did chalitza with Rachel, ma'amar with Leah. Or nasan get ubal. Or you went ahead and you gave a get to one, bia with the second. Oh, baal ubal, or bia with both of them. Oh, busy guy. Oh, baal v'asam ma'amar, or ultimately again bia with Rachel, ma'amar with Leah. Or nasan get v'chalatz, or you gave a get and chalitza. Ein achar chalitza klum. So Rabbi say, again, we're going to see why we need to illustrate, right, all of these cases when the core principles are really the same. So first of all, it's clear the Mishnah is paskening yesh get achar get, yesh ma'amar achar ma'amar. That's clear how the Mishnah is paskening. And halacha l'maisa again, it will say it's actually very straightforward. It's very straightforward. When there's ma'amar, you're going to have to get out of that with a get, right? No matter what. Once there's a ma'amar wife, you're going to have to get out of that, even if you did chalitza with the second wife. Once there's chalitza closes out the process, but there is an exception to that. If there was a ma'amar wife, right, if you did ma'amar with Rachel and chalitza with Leah, you're still going to have to give Rachel a get to get out of that ma'amar. Furthermore, once a get has been given, midrabanan now yibum becomes an impossibility. Okay, so the Gemara says these cases apply. Ben yavam echel shtei Yevamos. Bein shtei yavmin li Yevama achos. They both say all of this is true whether we're dealing with the case of one yavam to 2 Yevamos, or two brothers. Let's say to 1 Yevama. Chalatz va'asa ma'amar. If you did chalitza and then ma'amar, nasan get ubaal, o baal va'asa ma'amar, nasan get the chalatz. ein achar chalitza klum, bein betchila, bein be'emtza, bein besof. So both say, this is an actually very interesting statement that we're going to discuss, that whenever chalitza is done, chalitza ends the process no matter where in the continuum chalitza is performed. Once chalitza is done, ultimately, again, the process is completed, whether chalitza is done in the beginning, the middle, or the end. Incredible. Va'be'ila, so we'll say, what about bia? What about bia? Va'be'ila, bizman she betchila in acharei klum. So we'll say, bia is the first thing, like I will say in a case where Ruven does bia, right, Ruven does bia with Rachel. Right? Bia with Rachel. So we'll say, once there's a bia with Rachel, we'll say, what happens? What happens? Done. That's called Yibum. So we're done. So Be'ila, so we'll say, here's the interesting distinction between what we'll call Bia and Chalitza, or Yibum and Chalitza. Chalitza, we said, right, kind of slams on the brakes on the process whenever Chalitza is done, right? Once you do Chalitza, we're done. Then we'll say, that being said, there may be certain other things you might have to do to unwind other things, like if Ma'amar was done, you may still have to give a get, but Lamaisa, the process is closed. Once Chalitza is done, no matter where Chalitza is performed in the continuum of this process. Bia is different. If Bia is the first thing, Bizmashi B'tchila, Ein Acharei Klum, then Abba say, then we're done, right? So if Bia is the first thing that's performed, then Lamaisa, that's Yibum, and the process is closed. However, Be'emtza u'basof, Yesh Acharei Klum. I will say, here is the difference. Halacha l'maisa, if Bia is not the first thing. But let's say there was get, or there was ma'amar, or there are other things, then Bia does not go ahead and close down the process. Rabbi Nechemya Omer, achaz bi'ila, v'achaz chalitza, bein betchila, bein be'emtza, bein mazov, ein acharei klum. So as Rabbi Nechemya posits, that Bia and chalitza are the same. And whenever they are performed in the process, it shuts everything down. So both say, a really fascinating machlokas. Here's what's fascinating with this. Everyone agrees that chalitza, whenever performed in the process, ultimately shuts it down. Once chalitza is done, we're done. Again, that being said, you may have to do other things to kind of unravel other acts that have been performed, but chalitza brings this narrative to an end. Bia, what does Bia do? Right? Does Bia do the same thing like chalitza and kind of shut everything down or not? That's a machlokes. Tanakama holds Bia only shuts everything down when it's the first thing that's done. But if it's done either middle or end, it doesn't necessarily shut everything down. Rabbi Nechemya holds Bia is the same thing as chalitza. Once Bia is done, brings the entire process to a grinding halt. Mission accomplished. Good. I will say, let's analyze. Sa'ad kan lo pligi ela beget achar get u'ma'amar achar ma'amar. So the machlokes between Rabbi Gamliel and Chachamim is only in a case of get achar get and ma'amar achar ma'amar. However, aval get, we'll say first wide line, nun amud beis. Aval get echad biyevama u'ma'amar echad biyevama mahani. But I will say what it sounds like over here is as follows: that if halacha l'maisa, you gave a get to one person, to one woman, right? You gave a get to Rachel, and then ultimately again ma'amar with Leah, that would work. Mahani. So we'll say, take a look at Rashi just a moment. First Rashi in the Gemara, about 9 lines into Rashi. Aval get echad biyevama, o ma'amar echad biyevama, mahani get biyevama, lemekam below yivne, v'shuv lo yibem, u'ma'amar biyevama, mahani la lahatzicha get lema'amaro, ibai la fuka. Suppose to listen to this. The Gemara wants to suggest that the machlokes, Rabbi Gamliel and the Chachamim, was only when you're repeating the same process to both women. Same process to both women. Get achar get, ma'amar achar ma'amar. But halacha l'maisa, if you went ahead, says the Gemara, and did get to Rachel, and then ultimately ma'amar to Leah, that should work. Right? Again, look at Rashi. Aval get achad b'yivama, o ma'amar achad b'yivama, mahani get b'yivama, lemekam ale below yivne. So we'll say, if you were to give a get to Rachel, then halacha l'maisa, again, what that would do was ultimately, again, prevent you from marrying Rachel. Right? Ultimately, I will say, what we're going to see is midrabanan, and this is very interesting, midrabanan, the giving of a get essentially prohibits yibum, which is fascinating. This is all midrabanan. Right? Once you give a get, yibum becomes impossible. Yibum becomes impossible. V'shuv lo yibim, u'ma'amar b'ivam mahani la'atzricha get l'ma'amaro ibayla focus. Well, let's listen to this. Once you give a get to Rachel, what happens now if you were to do ma'amar with Leah? So the Gemara suggests everyone agrees that the get you gave to Rachel is effective. Effective in what sense? Effective in what sense? That you can't do yibum, and would say that if you were trying to do yibum, right, gives you the prohibition, you may not marry this woman, and therefore if you were to subsequently do ma'amar with Leah, what does the ma'amar with Leah require? A get. A get. Now, of course, what are you still going to need to go ahead and finish out this process? Chalitza. You're going to need chalitza. But Lamaisa will say the Gemara is picking up on the idea that the machlokes, Rabbi Gamliel and the Chum in the Mishnah, is when you're repeating the same process for both women. But if it's a get with Rachel and ma'amar with Leah, that would require a response for both women. That would work. And therefore, again, the get with Rachel says yibum is impossible, but doesn't dissolve the zika, right? The zika is still there, and therefore when he does ma'amar with Leah, that's going to require a get. So the Gemara says, Mahani, my time, what's the reason? My time, Amra Banan, get be Yevama Mahani. But say, this is incredible. Why does a get by a Yevama work? Let's just analyze it just a moment, right? Just a simple case. Shimon dies, leaves behind two women, Rachel and Leah. Reuven has a responsibility. Reuven gives Rachel a get. Reuven gives Rachel a get. Shabbos say, now what do we know from our Mishnah? Once you give a get, what does that do? What does it do? Rashi just said, once you give a get, you cannot do yibum. There is an isser to do yibum. Why? I would say, first, it's d'Rabbanan, it's not d'Oraisa. Mid'Oraisa, what happens? When you give a get to your Yevama, what happens? What happens? Absolutely nothing. So why did Chazal legislate that once you give a get to your Yevama, yibum is aser? To which the ones I'll tell you, this is incredible. About saying my time, get b'Yevama mahani mishum de mahani ba'alma. I'll tell you why. Because a get in general works. We'll say, what does a get do in the Welt, right? In the world, what does a get do? It dissolves a marital union. Di amrit lo mahani. Because if you say that when you give a get to your Yevama, it has no effect, amri, people will say, get lo tzia, the chalitza lo tzia. People will say, listen, get and chalitza are kind of the same thing, right? A get goes ahead and dissolves a marriage. Chalitza dissolves a marriage. Umidi get lo mahani, and since a get doesn't work over here, chalitza lo mahani. Also, chalitza doesn't really dissolve. Va'asi lemiva achar chalitza. Incredible, Abba say. Listen to this. What are Chazal concerned about? In halacha, we have two mechanisms for marital dissolution. What are the two mechanisms? Chalitza and get. And people kind of equate the two. So the Gemara says, what are we concerned about? If giving a get has absolutely no impact upon the Yevama, and if we ignore it, once you give a get, we say, nothing happened, and you could still do Yibum, people are going to confuse get and Chalitza, and they're going to think that what? That even after Chalitza, halacha l'maisa what? A person could go ahead and engage in Bia with the Yevama. And I will say, of course, there's nothing further from the truth. Because once you do Chalitza, then what? There is an Isser Da'oraisa to go ahead and live with this woman. Therefore, in order to avoid that confusion, Chazal said, once you give a get, Yibum is off limits. I will say we'll stop over here. We'll continue with Hashem with the Sugya tomorrow. Shkoyach.